Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Tiphera, my thoughts on her after having tested her for basically about a day in some, going through a bunch of different chaos, variations, builds, etc. And so with this, today we're going to break down some of her mechanics, her cards, her builds, partners, things of this nature. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. So the first thing that you might notice about Tiphera, of course, is that, well, in terms of her attribute and class, she is another order character coming straight after 9, and she is also a controller. Now, you may think, or you may be curious about whether she can be built as a DPS or what her role is, and, well, we'll talk about that in a moment, but just keep in mind, at least right now, what most players are using her as is somewhat of a supportive character that does technically have some access to damage, but as we'll break down and we'll see through a number of the builds and some of the higher end, I guess, save data runs, Tiphera right now is definitely being used more as a support than a DPS, if that's something that you're considering, but without, I guess, too much investment. Even her as a support I think is pretty strong. However, let's actually break down what she does, starting with her cards. So as usual, her generic cards are whatever. She has an attack card, she has a heal and shield card, which is pretty interesting as they're technically bundled into one, as opposed to having a separate shield or heal card together. And in terms of the cards that she has access to, first, Quantum Seed reads that it heals. It creates 2 archetype cards in the draw pile, and you draw one of them. Now, this will be a bit more obvious, or will make a little bit more sense later, but archetype cards are effectively a list of cards that you can create, or that are created when you cast certain cards or when you use certain card abilities. We'll see, or as we'll kind of break down, there are lots of different ways to actually make use of this, or just in general, there are a lot of different ways for you to customize Tiphera, and something that I do want to break out or kind of explain to start off is that though you may be tempted to look for a one-size-fits-all, or maybe if you aren't even doing that, if you are trying to understand how Tiphera works or how she'll feel raw or blind, something that you should understand is that she definitely feels really weird, or can feel kind of uncomfortable at times before you've actually gathered a proper deck, or before you've really set things in motion. As again, even if you look through some of the cards that you have access to, it may sound nice to have something like a heal or a shield or increase the damage of things, but especially during chaos, before you're able to predetermine or kind of set in stone what cards you're going to get, or kind of dedicate a hand to dealing damage, this will feel sometimes wasteful, or it'll feel like you'll have this extra AP and you can't do anything with it. Now, I won't go too far into it, but if we touch on the epiphanies, there are basically an unlimited number of epiphanies here that will work in some which way. Really, this also kind of feels a bit like Cassius in terms of RNG and how you want to, or how you may be able to play this character. Again, there are certain cards that definitely work, including some of the upgrades, if you do feel like you don't want to use some of these skills. However, what I found to be the most impactful, especially when it comes to, specifically regarding Quantum Seed, is having a 0-cost card. From what I've seen, there are, again, so many different variations of decks that work, and rather than specifically fixate on one specific card or one specific epiphany, what I actually found to be incredibly valuable when it comes to epiphanies, and this is not just about Tiphera, but for characters in general, is when you're able to get the bonus divine epiphany effects, and I've been playing for 2 hours, and you're then able to replicate said card. Now, again, this does mean that you'll have to have a pretty high save data or level for your world in order to copy, but for instance, and again, as we'll see later, there are some people that will take something like a Quantum Seed epiphany like here, where you get to select a specific archetype card, which by itself is already powerful. Again, if you're looking for something like specifically the APs, or if you're specifically looking like archetypes, both of these are pretty powerful. But just in general, I also would probably consider everything that you're seeing here to be valuable. However, if you add all of this on top of also having access to +1 AP or draw 1 as an effect on this epiphany, it flat out just becomes way more powerful, and is part of the reason why I wouldn't be super attached to any of the epiphanies that you see right now, as again, there are lots of different variations that will work, but it's definitely more rare and less common for you to have something like a divine epiphany that you have access to, and you don't necessarily see them nearly as often as some of the other cards. Now, as we move to something like the From Convergence, this is another card that I think is pretty interesting. Now, for this specifically at base, it says that you draw 2 archetype cards and you can double a random effect of those cards for 1 turn. Now, again, this has to deal with the archetype cards. The archetype cards by themselves are already pretty crazy. If you're able to double AP, if you're able to draw more archetype cards, if you're able to double the effect of this as a damage dealing card, all are great options here, right? However, as we take a look at the Epiphanies again, some of these are, I would say, a bit more versatile or a bit less versatile than what we saw from the Quantum Seed. And though there are certain things like, well, being able to draw 3 archetype cards and you can double the effect, being able to draw 4 archetype cards but having to effectively throw 1 away, but you know, technically it's exhaust, so it works for the rest of her kit. Even things like being able to change all of the archetype cards in your hand into a different one for a bit of RNG. This also reducing the cost to 0 while also, you know, having a retain effect. These are pretty cool or pretty interesting methods or different ways that you can approach From Convergence. However, again, for me personally, I found that having something like just the generic draw 3 double an effect is pretty decent. I also found, however, that again, having some of these cards, not just necessarily with their base epiphanies or their enhanced epiphany effects, but again, having something like morale, adding vulnerability, having AP, any of these draw sort of effects always to me sounded way more valuable by comparison. But if we move further to Creation and Destruction, this is probably the card that people will try to make highlights or clips of, and this is just a damage dealing ability that has a bit of extra effect attached to it. Now, of course, you could use this for its heal and its shield, and some of the epiphanies here are just slightly improved versions of this. You even have things like the retain, where the retain increases, and you can do this up to a max of 4 times. You can make this an upgrade, and when the AP is 0, you create one, and then you reduce the cost of this. And then you can even have, again, a super RNG DPS ability or DPS card here. But personally, I found this Creation and Destruction card here to be the funniest, as again, her whole deck revolves around exhausting cards. So if you're able to just wait long enough, or especially if you have a hand where you're able to exhaust all your cards almost immediately and just get out a metric ton of exhaust cards to begin with, you have a free, effectively 600 damage percent card that comes out. But again, if you are someone that is trying to play her as DPS, this is obviously going to be the card that you want to fixate on. Maybe a card that if you duplicate, let's say this, for instance, you can, of course, end up dealing lots of damage later. You could, of course, also duplicate something like this for damage. But of course, these are very high costing cards. And the elephant in the room is that, of course, if you're going to play her more support, there's a good chance that you wouldn't even keep Creation and Destruction in your hand. Now, okay, I do also want to touch on the topic of removal before we go further, because you could arguably remove, of course, like these top 3 cards, and none of these cards effectively do anything for you if you are playing support, or even if you're playing DPS. But for you to then begin removing or combing some of these other cards and removing them for slots, or, you know, to prevent, you know, having clutter in your deck, that may sound fine, but then the amount of cards that you're able to replicate, the amount of Divine Epiphanies you're able to replicate, the amount of neutral cards that you're able to basically take in your deck dramatically shifts, because removing 3 versus 4 cards is a big gap in Canyon in terms of AP. And though, again, it may be worth it, or maybe you RNG out of it, this just feels kind of risky at times. And again, especially if you're able to get a free kind of retain permanent Creation and Destruction that deals damage, it may be in your interest to not remove and have to remove 4 cards, again, so that you're able to take something like a Rally or one of the other cards that you can draw as a neutral card. But as we move to something like Dual Creation, this card I think is also pretty, I would say pretty interesting in terms of how you can use it. For myself personally, I think that having things that are unique or initiation alongside being an upgrade card is really nice, as of course there are a lot of equipments that will either allow you to activate things like this, or they will reduce the cost of certain cards if you have that one super protein unique trinket, or rather legendary trinket. But again, there are other effects that you can choose from here. all of which are really fine. I personally found that, again, in terms of what you may want to use, again, having things like, or I should clarify, having anything that affects your archetype cards in general can be nice. But again, I didn't find this to be super insane. Having or applying retain to certain cards could be really nice. Even accessing, I don't know, basically creating more of these cards is also really nice. I apologize, I had a brain fart. But again, I haven't found too much value necessarily in any of these specific dual creation cards as opposed to another. It really just feels like, though one may be better for a certain situation, this is such a versatile and broad upgrade card specifically, such that if you decide to go one direction, or if you feel like you're able to spam the archetype cards, if you feel that you are able to create multiple archetype cards, maybe you'll want to again have something like this. Or again, the reality from all this is that even if you just keep something that allows you to start with a unique initiation, and then if you decide to have a card or take whichever dual creation gives you AP or a free draw, also totally understandable. However, in terms of the actual effect of these cards, it really feels like who you pick or who you play with Tiphera specifically will address or will influence whether or not you want to take a specific dual creation. And this is something that you would probably have felt, especially if you played someone like Narja, though Narja, again, is a bit different, though again, technically speaking, both seemingly have a quote-unquote DPS ability or DPS lean if you choose to lean into it. Now, finally, the last card we have is Event Horizon. This card is pretty cool. Again, this gives you AP. It can scale and give you more AP. And again, as it reads form upgrade-wise, it says that while in hand, when an archetype card is activated, you increase a random effect by 100% until used, and you can stack this up to 3 times. This is pretty cool, of course. It allows you to draw more, it gives you more AP, and it also increases the damage amount of the first hit of the next attack card to balance itself a little bit. But in terms of its value, of course, this is a 2 cost, so unless if you are really able to continuously stack the form upgrade, or basically you have to ensure that you stack the form upgrade, otherwise this doesn't feel quite as worth it. But again, if you end up having a 3 AP providing 2 cost card, that's technically a net positive, of course, so you're going to use this. However, again, it is quite high cost, especially early on, and when you're doing something like the chaos runs, this definitely does not feel nearly as worthwhile as you'd expect, especially for the cost of 2 AP for being not really a heal, not really giving you much damage. It's 40% damage, and again, it's also 1 AP, 1 draw. In any case, as we move further, we should talk about partners. Now, I'd originally seen a lot of conversation about Tiana and how she may be super OP because, well, we have things like attack increases, we have crit chance finally for allies, and I agree, having crit chance is pretty valuable, but the reality is that, again, if you take a look at what some of these other cards already do, being able to increase the damage dealt, having really OP ego effects, like, again, being able to discard cards to then draw. Even Narja's card is pretty nice if you're trying to do, well, a more DPS oriented Narja. But again, if you're just taking a look at what support characters or what support cards you have access to, even things like having the increased heal amounts if you're trying to play more supportive. And as a reminder, as you take a look obviously at Tiphera herself, she does also kind of heal quite a bit, even though she's definitely used more for her AP and utility. This definitely doesn't feel like a partner card that you necessarily have to dump or unload everything into, but again, it is kind of hard to take away from or kind of ignore the obvious value of, well, said card. When the assigned combatant creates 3 exhaust cards, you increase the damage amount of the next attack card of all allies by 15%. It can stack, and it can stack up to 2 times. And again, if you have, if the assigned combatant has activated shield gain and heals through order cards, which of course she does because she's order, you also increase the crit chance for allies. it's kind of obvious, or it's kind of clear, that Tiana is by no means a bad partner card, but I do agree that though this is definitely a powerful partner card to begin with, it is by no means a life or death card if you don't have access to it. Truthfully, again, if you take a look at some of the other cards, even like the Yvonnes of the game, there are honestly pretty decent, lower cost cards, even if you don't have the limited or higher rank or higher tier replacements. Now, in terms of the set, however, I'm personally going to be using the Glories, or rather the Glories Reign set. This kind of, I would imagine, makes the most sense for Tiana. She obviously increases the damage of allies whenever she uses an exhaust skill card, and guess what? Her entire gimmick is around using exhaust skills. Now, I do kind of have a bit of damage here. Now, you could, of course, go for more HP, and that's totally fine, but I was a bit curious when testing to see how much damage she would actually do, and respectably and transparently, she does do a lot of damage with her creation and destruction card if you decide to fully invest in, or especially if you take rather the variant that gives her the 600% damage, or the 600% damage scaling. This does actually deal a pretty respectable amount of damage, especially if you build her for damage. But realistically, if you want to take something like HP instead, that's also fine. No problems here. Now, I do want to also touch on her secondary set. Again, I have her personally on damage at the moment, but if you decide to use something like HP, if you decide to use defense, as again, she technically scales off of defense, and use something along those lines for a more defensive set, that's also fine too. But the reality is that, as with most characters, if you end up using this as a triple set sort of character, if you don't want to farm for the Glories Reign set, that's also okay. But let's actually now touch a moment on the potentials for this character. Her potential nodes include, for the unique stats, it reads that if you have more than 300 defense, you gain, or rather you provide 10 crit damage to all allies. Absolutely insane, huge, and definitely one of the highest priorities in her kit. For her unique card proficiency, it says 5% increased heal and shield gain for archetype cards, and if Tiphera's defense is greater than 250, you add an additional 5% to this modifier. Also just insane and pretty good value, especially for players that are trying to struggle through some of the chaos content, as again, she definitely needs it, and she is by no means an unflawed or a perfect chaos run character. As we move, however, to the basic card proficiency, being able to obviously gain or rather decrease the heal amount of the buried deployment card to 70%, while also adding a 70% shield effect is nice. And again, I understand reducing the heal amount here for a shield doesn't necessarily sound amazing, but again, it is a technical improvement here, so there's really no reason to not do it. Though again, in my opinion, this basic card reads a little bit similar to E1 Yuki, where it's like, well, why didn't you just make the card 70% heal and shield to begin with? Like, what is the point of? But anyways, in terms of obviously the other stats that you'll focus or fixate on, of course, you'll want to invest in her unique card upgrades. Gaining the free stats from defense proficiency and crit chance proficiency are also fine, but again, if you're using her as a support character, you may not really need this crit chance. Now, as we move to the manifesto, or rather the manifest egos, some of these are pretty cool, and I'm actually a big advocate for taking a look at these manifest egos and seeing which of these you really like. Primarily because we're getting a bunch of the free it's not I don't believe it's called a memory code. I think it's called an Omega code. And for this specifically, as you can read, her first manifest ego reads that it changes the max stat count of form upgrade for the event horizon card from 3 to 4. And honestly, this is pretty nice. It does mean effectively that you can get a 4 AP card. Does this, or rather, is this really worth your Omega code with other characters like Serenial and other really OP DPS on the market? Tough to say. I'm personally a fan, however, of what we've seen already. And again, if you choose not to invest in these supportive characters because you're trying to invest in a DPS, I would only caution you that, again, it feels like a lot of the DPS are a bit more situational. Even 9, who I would imagine is probably for all intents and purposes, just a power crept version of Yuki. She doesn't seem nearly as foolproof as some of the other DPS, and even some of the strongest, more seasonal characters like Serenial are technically also being built against in certain cases or against certain bosses, where it feels like if you play out a deck that has multiple usable cards in a row, they'll design a mechanic to stop you from doing so. Now, M2, or rather, I guess Ego 2 is pretty cool too. It reads that when an archetype is activated, you gain the shape effect, and when the shape effect stacks to 3, you create one card consisting of the stack shape effects. So again, this means you get a heal, you can increase the damage amount by 30 or 300%, and you can also draw one archetype card, and this can only be activated once per turn, with the shape effect being removed once it's activated. Now, again, as far as I understand, this basically means that you get an extra card, I believe. Like, for every archetype card, you activate another archetype card. That's fine. I think this is pretty nice, all things considered, because again, this is something like 2 AP, double the damage, or again, something like additional heal. Or rather, I believe, actually, I don't think this is double heal, but I think double AP. I think this is extra heal. This looks pretty cool, but even in terms of gaining an extra, or rather drawing another archetype card, that's also effectively what I understand to be the same thing as getting 2 AP. However, if we move further, you have things like the third ego. This increases the creation count of resonance to 3 times. And again, this is also pretty nice. However, honestly, from her ultimate, it feels like with all these different sources of creating cards, you almost run out of space. And that's not to say that this is bad by any means, but it's a bit tough for me to necessarily to kind of pinpoint how much you'll actually be using something like this ego skills card. And on top of this, honestly, especially if you're playing someone like 0 and you have, or not 0, 9, and you have her signature partner, her partner actually has a pretty powerful caustic debuff on the enemy, which I would say probably recommend in most cases to use over spamming something like these extra archetype cards, especially once you get a more refined or more perfectly designed loadout. But as we move to the Ego 4, this one reads that when Tiphera's archetype card is used, you gain power of archetype effect. Now, this increases the damage amount of attack cards by allies by 5%, increases order damage by allies by 5%, and also increases basically damage of defense characters by 5% too. And at the end of the turn, you remove power of archetype, with this having a max of 2 stacks. Now, this is just a damage buff, basically. Pretty nice, all things considered. It is also nice that you can, of course, stack this effect, but it does also mean that you have to be a bit conscious of obviously what or how many stacks you have in general. But again, more damage to your cards on a support character, always going to be nice. And as we move to the 5th ego, this increases the level of the cards, which is fine. Finally, though, we have our 6th ego, and this increases damage, or rather, it receives or adds an effect to Tiphera's unique cards, granting damage amount increase gained from archetype triangle cards, but are charged to not be consumed. Now, from what I understand, this is, again, there's a lot of different reading and a lot of different terms in this. With this next line, which reads that at the start of battle, change archetype triangles damage amount from 30 to 35% and the stacks from 300 to 350%. I think this just means that you are able to, use, as far as I understand, you're able to maybe use one additional card, or you're able to use a card one time without being consumed. And then obviously they've also buffed or changed the stacks, or the stacking amount, to scale infinitely, or not infinitely, but scale higher. Obviously this goes from 30 to 35% and 300% rather to 350%. This is probably one of the stronger looking support cards, or rather support egos, that we've seen, and support effects in general. But honestly, this is an E6, or rather a manifest ego 6. So whether this feels very worthwhile, a bit difficult to say at the moment. Now, I do also want to talk about the teams that you'll see Tiphera with, but truth be told, it's a bit more difficult to break this down, mostly because Tiphera, with how broad and how general her kit is, kind of works with everyone. Honestly, this kind of feels like trying to find the perfect team for a character like Mika, in the sense that Mika basically works with everyone. Now, of course, this does mean that you have to kind of curate your deck a little bit, but even if you just have a generalized Tiphera deck that just gives you AP or draw, I mean, there are 100 different characters that work with this. If you want Mei Lin, if you want to use multiple, or find lots of, or include lots of card search or library searching or deck searching through Tiphera's cards, and use that to have an infinitely damage dealing Mei Lin, that's fine. If you want to use that to cycle through or use all of Serenial's missiles and the buff cards that obviously also still cost AP beforehand and stack AP on Tiphera, that also works. If you want to use Yuki and increase the damage of her cards, and again draw more cards so that you can maybe reduce the cost of one of the old, if I'm not mistaken, it was one of the old like void cards, or one of the old mutant cards that like reduces its cost every single time that you draw a card. That also works for Yuki. It's just, this character literally works with basically every single DPS that I've seen so far. I've seen her currently right now on teams with 9. I've seen it with Serenial. I've seen it with Chizuru. I've seen it with Mei Lin. I've seen it with, honestly, even DPS Narja. I've seen it with Renoa. And again, there's no shortage of characters that, basically want AP or want draw. And even with how broad and generic her buffs are, what sort of character doesn't want, again, a buff to the team, or damage, or increased damage, or healing, or shielding? The answer is every single character wants something like that in general. Now, in terms of the deck that I have, again, I've gone through a couple different variations. I really have not been lucky enough to actually find a version of Quantum Seed that I want, and that I was able to duplicate, mostly because I've been kind of getting scammed and baited by like the new season, and I've been trying to make like way better decks for some of my other DPSs, even though they're pretty good. Again, not a great move. It's just a bit brain dead and dented. But in terms of what I have currently, yes, I have been duplicating the Quantum Seed. I did also want to, kind of try duplicating the Form Convergence. I was waiting to see if maybe I could find a -1 AP cost to the Form Convergence, and then I could, again, maybe draw more cards if I've already luckily created the Quantum Seeds. Again, it really depends if or how lucky really the deck that I get is. If I could undo it though, I would definitely probably take a look at one of the other epiphanies that we touched on earlier, where again you get to just create a specific card, which I think is pretty valuable, especially if you get a 0 cost Quantum Seed. But again, as a reminder, what I have right now is by no means perfect. As you can see, it's only a 120 point deck, and again, I definitely don't have the perfect equipment cards here, though this is basically what I'm rocking at the moment. Now, in terms of gear, I do also want to point out that, again, having things like, having like the 4-leaf clover or the blue 4-leaf clover that increases damage, having basically any sort of chess piece that involves or works with exhaust, I think is pretty powerful, especially for how often Tiphera exhausts. And finally, for me, using something like Sneering Dagger, not caring about this slot or really any flex slot, I think is pretty fine. But finally, I'd like to actually talk about the pros and cons for Tiphera. And for me, I think the obvious pros is that she's very generic, or she's very versatile if you want to spin it more positively. In terms of cost of card, once you get things more situated, it does feel like she's definitely one of the more cost-effective supports. It doesn't feel like you're spending too much AP, especially once you reduce some of the other cards. But of course, I also feel like she also kind of has been designated as like the best support for some of the more recent content, and that's kind of a pro, but also a con, just thematically or conceptually, which I know not many people are super fans of. But as we actually move to cons, I do think that basically the only real con that I have for her is that if you're trying to play her DPS, she doesn't really fit that niche quite as well as you'd think, which is less of a con and more of just like a note or kind of like an asterisk. But also the more important con that I'd like to actually address is the fact that her chaos run just feels way weaker than like almost any of the other characters that I've touched. And again, this is not so much so because like, oh my god, I'm expecting to have a perfect chaos save data deck as soon as I load in, but it's rather like the damage increases or the way that you get the buffs from her chaos runs don't feel nearly as impactful. And this isn't even just for when you're trying to farm a specific Tiphera deck, but even when you're just using her casually as a support, not having multiple of these Quantum Seeds or not having multiple of the Form Convergences or any of these upgrades with AP and, very lucky epiphanies feels pretty bad. Like, to kind of give a give a similar feeling or to compare, if you were to use someone like Mika, or if you were to use someone like Nine, they are almost like so simple and generically designated to do one specific thing, that they're almost like powerful in that sense. And again, for someone like Mika, if you enter into a run with Mika and all she has is like 4 cards or maybe like 5-6 cards, having something like an extra heal, having the source of water inevitably, which you'll have in most cases, and then having things like deluge or tactical analysis, these are like very low cost cards, or cards that give you back your value, especially if you have M6 Mika. But even for someone like Nine, if you have some like a card like Hue that just does an infinity amount of damage, and you don't really need to duplicate anything in your deck, you're obviously going to feel way more powerful. However, the main issue for me is that Tiphera is not really the same way. Yes, you can obviously use Tiphera in chaos, in the chaos systems and things like this for your roguelike runs, and it'll feel fine, but it kind of feels like the glue is missing, and that for me is probably the biggest slap on the wrist for Tiphera. Though again, as soon as, or the second that you take her into a seasonal data pack, I feel like she becomes easily one of the most insane supports that we've ever seen. That's going to be it for everything that I found, tested, and experimented with when it comes to Tiphera, though, guys. Thanks again for watching. I apologize. There's been so much going on recently. I have definitely been playing a lot of Tiphera and enjoying everything that I found, but as you've seen, I'm still trying to find the perfect epiphany so I can kind of work off these things. But thanks again for watching, though, guys. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.